It's July of 1861. More than 3 months have elapsed since the shots fired at Fort Sumter marked the start of the American Civil War between the United States of America, or the Union, and the newly seceded Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. During this time, both sides had been making due preparations for a full-scale war. The Confederacy, led by President Jefferson Davis, has taken up the offensive at once. The Confederate Army of the Potomac, consisting of about 20,000 men led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, had taken up positions near Manassas Junction, along the southern banks of the Bull Run River, no more than 25 miles away from Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union. At the same time, the Army of the Shenandoah, consisting of 9,000 men and led by Joseph Johnston, was stationed in a defensive position in the Shenandoah Valley. Meanwhile, Union President Abraham Lincoln, desperate to relieve the direct threat on Washington, D.C., had ordered General Irvin McDowell, commander of the Union Army of Northwestern Virginia, to begin offensive operations. McDowell, despite his limited field commanding experience and the negligible training of his soldiers, nonetheless gathered his army of 35,000 men and decided to begin campaigning. McDowell's plan was quite simple. He would consolidate his entire army at Centerville, a small hamlet a few miles away from the northern banks of the Bull Run, and attempt to drive back Beauregard with a flanking maneuver, and then subsequently forcing the Confederate Army to fall back all the way to the Rappahannock River, thus relieving some of the pressure upon Washington, D.C. The campaign would be additionally aided by the 18,000 men under Union General Robert Patterson, who was locked in tight battle with General Johnston in the Shenandoah Valley, and would keep the latter's 8,000 men from joining with Beauregard. McDowell departed Washington, D.C. on July 16th, and his badly trained and undisciplined army took 2 whole days to cover the 20 miles by road. They arrived at Centerville on July 18th, with their number reduced to 31,000 after a few thousand men were dispatched to protect the army's rear. There, McDowell searched for a way to outflank Beauregard, who had formed his lines along the southern banks of the Bull Run. Shortly after arriving, McDowell dispatched Brigadier General Daniel Tyler with more than 8,000 men to attempt to force his way across the eastern part of the Bull Run and around the Confederate right flank. Tyler, expecting resistance to be minimal and to be able to pass through without battle, instead was drawn into a skirmish with Confederate soldiers near Blackburn's Ford and made no headway at all. Later that same day, Confederate General Joseph Johnston decided, after receiving a telegram, to attempt to slip away from Patterson, who was shadowing him closely in the Shenandoah Valley, and march eastward with his 9,000 men to join Beauregard at Manassas Junction. Quietly departing from Winchester, and with his movements effectively screened by General J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry, Johnston was able to slip past Patterson undetected, and instantly began a swift 12-mile-long march towards Beauregard's forces stationed at Bull Run. In the meanwhile, on the Union side, McDowell was growing more and more frustrated and felt the need for swift actions. Not only had he received some rumors that Johnston had slipped away from Winchester, but also the enlistments of a few thousand men under his command were due to expire in a matter of weeks. After much consideration, McDowell at last resolved to attack the Confederate left flank instead of the right. His plan was to have Tyler's division attack at Stone Bridge, while the thousands of men under Brigadier Generals David Hunter and Samuel Heintzelman would turn the Confederate flank by attacking at Sudley Springs Ford. At the same time, Colonel Israel Richardson, with his 4,000 men, would keep the enemy soldiers at Blackburn's Ford occupied and tie them down long enough for the flanking maneuver to succeed. However, this plan relied heavily on Patterson, who was to detain Johnston's forces in the Shenandoah Valley. It was this that Patterson had already failed to do. On July 20th, Johnston's forces arrived at Manassas Junction after a swift journey by rail, and the fresh reinforcements bolstered Beauregard's army from 20,000 to nearly 30,000. There, the 2 Confederate generals resolved to make their main drive up from Blackburn's Ford with Johnston's men towards the Union right flank, and subsequently directly to Centerville, where McDowell had set up his headquarters. To defend the various crossings across the Bull Run against attack, Brigadier General Richard Ewell was stationed at Union Mills Ford, and multiple regiments under Colonel Nathan Evans were posted at Stone Bridge. The sun set on July 20th, with both armies readily prepared for battle. At 2 o'clock a.m. on July 21st, the Union Army made the first move. Tyler moved out towards Stone Bridge with his division of 8,000 men to force his way across the ford. At the same time, Hunter and Heinzelman, each commanding more than 6,000 soldiers, began the march towards Sudley Springs Ford as planned. The Union Army's lack of training, however, began taking a toll on their speed at such a critical moment, and with disorganized ranks and jumbled lines of communication, the march stretched on for many long hours. At 5 a.m., Richardson drew out his cannon and opened fire on the Confederate lines across the Bull Run, alerting Beauregard of the Union attack. At the time, the main part of the Confederate Army was stationed at Blackburn's Ford under Johnston, and a sudden assault on the left flank was unexpected. Leaving a few regiments to hold the ford, Johnston immediately dispatched most of his men to the left flank to reinforce the Confederate soldiers there. However, with disorganized communication lines, it would take many hours for the reinforcements to arrive, and for the time, a few thousand soldiers under Evans were all that the Confederate left flank had to counter the 10,000 Union soldiers that were already approaching the area. Evans, seeing the two-pronged Union drive, quickly deployed his men into position at Matthews Hill on the northern banks of Young's Branch, with the hopes of slowing the enemy's advance. With heavy artillery and musket fire, they were able to delay the Union advance long enough for the advance regiments of Johnston to arrive at the hill before the main Union attack came. The Confederate left flank, which now consisted of nearly 3,000 men, engaged face-to-face with Hunter and Heinzelman advancing from the north, and though the fighting was fierce, the outnumbered Confederates were slowly pushed back. At around 10:30 a.m., the leading regiments under Tyler finally arrived at Stone Bridge, and forded the unguarded Bull Run swiftly. Then the Union soldiers charged up the hill, and struck hard at Evans' right flank. With the attack coming from both sides, the Confederate line buckled and collapsed, and the soldiers fled back across Young's Branch and regrouped on Henry Hill, south of Matthews Hill. McDowell was given a perfect chance to deliver a swift attack, which very likely would have ended the battle, since adequate Confederate reinforcements had not yet arrived, but he instead decided to hold and bombard the enemy positions so that the lagging rear of the Union Army could have time to arrive. This, however, gave time for additional Confederate soldiers to reach the hill, and at around noon, Brigadier General Thomas Jackson, more often known as Stonewall Jackson, arrived with his division at the head of Johnston's relief force. Stuart's cavalry also came up from the side of the hill to strengthen the Confederate lines. The arrival of additional reinforcements gave Jackson time to assemble a line of defense. Posting his men on the reverse slope of the hill, thus shielding them from fire, he hauled up 13 cannon to the ridge and opened fire down the opposite slope towards the advancing Union soldiers. Unable to drive up the hill, McDowell ordered the Union cannon to be positioned on Dogan Ridge and fire back at the Confederate batteries, which were only 300 yards away. However, Jackson's cannon were better equipped for shorter ranges, and the Union cannon mostly fired straight over the hill, inflicting few casualties upon the Confederates. By that time, as reinforcements from both sides continued to trickle in, the Union soldiers had driven up the western slopes of Henry Hill, and the two armies engaged in fierce rifle fire at close range. The Union guns were drawn up at the center of the line, and they advanced forward slowly up the hill. At 3 p.m., Jackson ordered a fierce attack on the revealed Union artillery, hoping to capture the numerous guns. Under heavy fire, Jackson's Virginian regiments charged forward, and though receiving serious casualties, managed to reach the cannon and drive back the gunners and infantry nearby, successfully capturing them. However, they had barely time to make use of the guns when additional Union soldiers advanced forward and engaged in short-range battle with the Confederates. In the ensuing confusion, the cannon changed hands multiple times before at length the Confederates prevailed and drove their counterparts down the hill, successfully capturing a good part of the Union artillery. This turned the tide of the battle. At 4 p.m., Jackson ordered a full-scale attack on the disorganized and demoralized Union soldiers, and the Confederates stormed down the hill, engaging in fierce musket fire with their counterparts and shouting loud battle cries. At the same time, Stuart's cavalry attacked the Union soldiers occupying Chin Ridge and drove them back, successfully gaining the hill. The Confederate center, in the meanwhile, began prevailing, and they slowly pushed the Union soldiers off Henry Hill and across Young's Branch. Hoping to press his advantage and receiving additional reinforcements, Beauregard ordered his entire line forward, and the Confederates charged down the hill and stormed on the buckling Union line. The inadequately trained and demoralized Union soldiers began to panic, and McDowell's army started to disintegrate. Around 5 p.m., the Union line collapsed, and the soldiers began a full rout towards Centreville, fleeing the battlefield in small disorganized groups. McDowell, failing to rally his men together, assembled a hasty rearguard with a few regiments, while the rest of his army fled wildly across the Bull Run, all the while pursued by Confederate gunfire. In the ensuing confusion, hundreds of Union soldiers were captured, while equipment, firearms, and gunpowder were abandoned in large amounts. Despite the confusion amidst the Union ranks, however, Beauregard and Johnston decided to not pursue the faltering enemy, since their army had been left in great disorganization as well, and Richardson's fresh brigades were blocking the road to Centreville. Though it had been a stunning victory for the Confederates, casualties on both sides were high, and it was easily the bloodiest battle fought in United States history at the time. Union casualties included 400 killed, 1,000 wounded, and another 1,000 captured. Confederate casualties included 300 killed and 1,500 wounded. The First Battle of Bull Run is often recognized as the first major battle of the American Civil War. In some ways, it was an awakening call for leaders on both sides, as for the first time they realized how determined and strong their opponents were, and how difficult it would be to defeat them. Particularly for Lincoln, this sudden debacle came as a very shocking blow. He had previously thought that the First Battle of Bull Run would be the end of Confederate resistance. Instead, his 30,000-strong army had fought a horrifying defeat at the doorstep of Washington, D.C., and the entire future of the United States of America was left in darkness.